very good morning. You're joining us here on a new episode of Melt. I'm Ritvika Gupta, and on the show today we'll be in conversation with Matthew Harrington, Global COO at Edelman. Anant Rangaswamy, editor of Melt, joins me today. Hi, Anant.
Hello.
Anant, so your conversation with Matthew was about trust in brands. So what do you think, especially when it comes to brands in India, are they doing enough to maintain trust?
See, I was at Praxis, which is a fairly large, well-run conference on PR.
Yeah.
And therefore, there was a collection of some wonderful thinkers from the PR community on various aspects of PR which are affecting them today. So Matthew is one of three people we speak to at Praxis, and all those conversations somehow or the other come towards trust.
Right.
In this particular case, I've been following Edelman for more than 20-25 years, and they do the best global audit on the impact of trust on various pillars of society. So they've been measuring trust in government, trust in businesses, trust in NGOs, and trust in politics.
Yeah.
And this year they've done trust in business, but they have done a subset on trust in brands. How important is it for consumers to trust the brands that they buy? What is the upside for brands if consumers trust them? What is the downside if consumers don't trust them? How difficult is it to maintain trust? These are all very, very important questions. And Matthew, as the COO of Edelman, he speaks to clients across the world and almost evangelizes the need for trust in brands.
All right. Do you think brands today are under increasing pressure to be also transparent, and is it even possible?
Sorry, to answer your first question, which I realized I didn't answer, there's not enough conversation about trust in brands in India. That's one. And transparency, as we will see from this conversation and from two subsequent conversations we have, one is with Melissa from V Communications, and we spoke to Barry from Ketchum. And all of them speak about trust and transparency. And in fact, hopefully our viewers will watch all three shows and get a better sense. Melissa follows in a couple of weeks, and then we have Barry a couple of weeks after that. So all our viewers will be exposed to all three conversations, and there's a lot they can learn from that.
All right, so let's have a look at the conversation. Let's get ready to melt with Matthew Harrington.
Morning, Matt.
Hello, how are you?
So I'm good as always, and happy to have you here in India.
Good to be back.
So to begin with, Edelman has been measuring trust in various parts of our daily lives. You have trust in business, trust in government, trust in NGOs, and so on. Now, you were already measuring trust in business. Why did you come down to finding the need to measure trust in brands?
Yes.
So what's the nuance, or is it not a nuance?
No, I think it is a nuance.
Right.
And as you point out, we've been studying trust in business for 20 years.
Right.
But just in the last couple of years, we've seen a shift in consumers' expectations around what they expect of the brands they go to purchase
Right.
and that they invite into their lives. And we saw people both adopting new brands, disruptor brands, as well as rejecting brands maybe that didn't reflect who they are in terms of their values. So that led us to want to really understand what is going on distinct from trust in business to what is the nature of trust in brands by the consumer.
Right. So explain this to me. Now, earlier when you said trust in business, we were talking about, say, a Unilever and a Procter & Gamble and a Coca-Cola Corporation and so on.
Right, or J&J.
But what you're saying now is it's got to come down to a level of a Dove soap or a Sprite and so on and so forth.
There's a more educated consumer, I think,
Right.
and a more sophisticated consumer globally. And when a consumer goes to shelf, they're actually wanting to know who's behind Dove.
Right.
And Unilever, for the longest time, had a family of brands, but it stood on their own merit. And I think one of the initiatives that the company's driven in the last decade or so is actually to have Unilever associated with every single one of their brands across all categories. Johnson & Johnson, the same thing. It used to be that J&J just spoke about the brand Band-Aid or
Right.
their baby care line, but not Tylenol and not a host of their other medical device areas. But now consumers want to know, and so companies are being more active in connecting the business to the brand.
Right. So tell me how you join the dots. Why should I, as a CEO, work at all on trust? Earlier, all I had to do was put out a good product. A good soap was enough. Now you're saying, no, that's not enough, you've got to do a lot more. So explain that to me.
Yeah, so our study showed that there are sort of 3 gates through purchase consideration now that consumers bring to the shelf in the store. The first is the product. Will it deliver as advertised in terms of its benefits or functional aspects? The second piece is as it relates to, does it solve a consumer interest or problem, and therefore, again, meet need? And then the third gate is really, what is the brand doing in its community? How is it contributing to society? And it doesn't have to be at the big level. It can be very much literally, how are you engaging in a local market? And people have a great deal of affinity and more trust. 2/3 of consumers, as we studied, have more trust in the brands that address all 3 of those gating areas.
Yeah. So how does it change the dynamics for a marketer? Earlier, he didn't have to worry about the third gate at all. Right? He or she. Yeah.
Right, just sold feature
so,
and ingredient.
And check, whether there's a promise mismatch or a promise match between advertising and the
So
product.
for the marketer, it's a heightened level of responsibility on multiple levels, because it's thinking through what is the right way for a brand to engage in community or society, and then how to activate that. So I think that we've seen some brands do it very, very well.
Can you share some examples of?
Yeah, I think, that getting back to Unilever, Lifebuoy and their hand washing program in India has to help children really.
Child Reach 5.
The Hygiene Reach 5 is just a fantastic program that creates education, action, and results that matter to a community and to families. The converse, I think, are programs where they're stunts. They're just marketing stunts. There's no substance behind them. There's not a call to action. There's neither a call to action for the consumer nor some sort of demonstrative.
Do you want to put your neck out and give me an example of something which is just a stunt?
Well, I think one that got called out for being a marketing ploy was McDonald's in its efforts to acknowledge International Women's Day, which is a very good effort, turned its M, the signature M, into a W.
Right. You're saying that had no depth.
It didn't have any depth, and it called out as such.
Right.
And I think another one that is probably worth noting is Audi launched a very well-received campaign trying to bring attention to gender equality, pay equality, women and men, and yet sort of the day 2 story was their executive team only is composed of 2 women out of 12, and therefore they aren't themselves walking the talk.
Right.
And I think that's another, for a marketer, that's part of both challenge and opportunity in engaging in this new era where brands need to be thinking about how they stand up and reflect values of both the business and of the brand.
So on the one extreme, you give me the Lifebuoy story. The other extreme, you give me the Audi story and the McDonald's story. Where does the Nike story fit? The Colin Kaepernick story?
True to brand.
Right.
I think Nike has, for the longest time, sought to spark conversation, leverage its advertising might and muscle to bring attention to issues. They very cleanly own that the advertising with Colin was a marketing initiative and effort, supporting the premise of the need for a conversation around the treatment of African Americans by law enforcement. Their share price got hit in the early days of that campaign, with a lot of people taking issue with, where is Nike getting off engaging in such a sensitive, fraught social issue? And yet they knew what they were doing. They very intentionally were trying to appeal to an 18 to 35-year-old consumer, in many instances who was
neither black nor white, or it could be anything.
Just that consumer base,
age demographic,
who were, in some instances, some of them were disaffected with the brand, and were, had sort of walked away from the brand. And that was a galvanizing moment. And the sales, the quarter after that ad campaign bore out that they had penetrated. Their sales rose. Their sweet spot consumer is 18 to 35, and so it was an extraordinarily successful campaign.
When you take positions such as the Nike position, could you have a very good product get into deep trouble if you do it wrong?
Oh, absolutely.
Right. So how does a marketer guard against that? Now, there's a lot of pre-measurement that I understand took place in the Nike case. So does that mean the marketer cannot just go by what he thinks his consumers want, but then research it intensely before putting it in the market?
I think the marketing playbook is a more complex one than it used to be,
Right.
where you could just sell the product.
Right.
And in some instances that still works today.
Right.
But I also think marketers need to be attuned to and sensitized to how to engage in and prompt and foster conversation.
Right.
I don't think marketers who rely wholly on a 30-second ad or a traditional advertising channel are going to succeed in the marketplace today. There's just too much with social and the power of conversation that exists because of social opportunity for brands to connect to consumers. And if you're going to be engaged in a conversation, you have to think strategically about how to advance it constructively and positively, and do some devil's advocate work where you're worrying about how could it go bad, how could it go wrong, which constituency could attach themselves to this and take it to a negative place. And that is a different set of muscles that I think marketers need to build.
So tell me, are we going to see in future cases that somebody like Edelman gets called in before a large marketing initiative rather than during or after?
We already, in the work that we do with our clients, help them think through all of the permutations of a campaign.
Right.
And we run campaigns for numerous clients that are earn-centric, that look to foster conversation, peer sharing, really turn the brand over to the consumer group and let it go. And that's, I think, part of the excitement of marketing today is that if you are open to letting your brand be experimented with, played with by the consumer, a lot of good can happen and a lot of really positive things.
Almost the very definition is saying, I put out something and then it's out of my control.
Well, it is risky.
Right.
And
so are you saying that's a new reality, that selling, marketing is a far more risky business?
I think so.
You do?
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, it is a challenging and sometimes pretty fraught world in terms of the ways in which there's a lot of polarized conversation in the marketplace. And brands can get pulled into that, even unknowingly, without any sort of desire to be in the mix. You can't stand by. You can't be passive in this marketplace now.
Right.
If somebody does attach themselves to your brand and it doesn't reflect your values, you've got to engage in conversation.
Today we are wired, and consumers can talk to the brands and about the brands 24/7 without any permission from the brand itself.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we come from an era, perhaps 20 years ago, if you turn the clock back, crisis management was one of the many things that all comms consultants did. It was one of the tick boxes, and hopefully no crisis ever came. You were ready for it, everybody was ready for it, but you didn't see a crisis. Here, a mini crisis could sort of evolve in seconds after you and I finish talking. So tell me, how do you help your client get geared to this? Especially in the area of brands.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me as someone who's spent my career involved in issues in crisis management, how changed the dynamic is. When the internet arrived, it was a much slower pace. It was a more traditional media environment, and we would work with our clients to ensure that they never let a news cycle go by without responding to the crisis as it was unfolding. Strive for maximum transparency, engagement, and consistency in communication. Much different calculus needs to be measured at the moment, which is something may surface online that is explosive, inflammatory, but you need to watch first. Don't immediately engage. And this was a big learning for me, that your traditional instinct to pick up the gauntlet and fight isn't always the right answer.
Right.
Because it could be an instance that it's just a dust fire and it's not going to gain traction.
So
And
how at this, sorry, I'm going to interrupt. How engaged are you and the client at this moment?
Very.
When the fire sort of emerges, before you can decide whether it's a real fire or a dust fire.
So very engaged because we're
So explain that to me, just make it simple for me to understand. How does that interaction take place physically?
well, fortunately, because we all have monitoring systems,
Right.
and we're all 24/7, real time, actively, trafficking Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all the social channels, WhatsApp, etc. You're able to see when your brand is being talked about,
Right.
well beyond customer complaints. It could be that your brand has been dragged into something, or somebody's made an accusation about your brand. So you see that immediately, and we go right into a war room mode with our clients, where there's essentially the line is open, either via phone or text, to be constantly sort of assessing what are we working with here. Is it just a little smoke, or is it going to build? Who's reading this? Who's the post from? Do they have an influencer community? Is it getting picked up, that influencer community that has a broader network? What is the likelihood of this expanding?
Right.
And therefore you need it's a watch wait, which is often very difficult for brands and marketers who want to get into the mix of it. But if you determine, and we do this work very real time, that it's getting too much oxygen and it's going viral, then we propose a strategy and a plan of attack. That will have been thought through already, but it's just a function of when do you pull the trigger.
Yeah. Now, earlier, you got a brief from a client, and you often had, say, 3, 4, 5 days to even draft a press release. Here, in a real-time crisis, whether it's a holding statement or just a tweet, maybe, to a press release, to a press conference, to a statement by the chairman, all these things could need to happen in minutes.
Pretty
so tell me,
rapidly.
is there a new SOP that needs to evolve between the consultant and the brand so that this can be done in almost real time?
There absolutely needs to be a new SOP,
Right.
and it's. I think the brands that are really successful at this, the consultant is in lockstep with the brand team, the digital team, and with a client's general counsel.
Right.
Because the last thing we want to do is anything that harms the company from a perspective as it relates to its license to operate. And so part of that process and procedure is ensuring that general counsel is informed, engaged, and I find increasingly good general counsels are as interested and have studied the world of social media to understand that engagement is a requirement.
Right. So how many general counsels are hired by Edelman? Is that needed? Do you need to hire more? Is that a new skill? All of you need to have in-house now.
Well, we have a very good legal team,
Right.
But we need to make certain that our colleagues understand that as an important element
Right.
of helping a client, is ensuring that do no harm, while we're also trying to help protect them. And so that's something that our teams are sensitive to, and we help our clients through that process.
Right. Matt, there's a word you use twice in responses to me now, which is transparency, which is suddenly bubbling up. If you looked at a word cloud of words used at conferences, transparency will be much higher than it used to be 5 years ago. So again, how important is transparency today? I mean, you would think to sell a soap, why do I need to be transparent, for God's sake?
Well, it goes right back to trust,
right.
which is that if we've seen over the last 20 years, genuine fluctuation, but for the most part downward trend in trust of business, government, media, and NGOs, how do you counteract? How do you build resilient trust? Well, you inform and you share, and you are more open about how you went about making the product, where you sourced the ingredients or the materials, what are your labor practices. All of that is necessary today because you've got a distrusting consumer on the worst case, but you ultimately have a more informed consumer, a more cynical consumer who you need to educate. And transparency is the best route to
Right.
education. Lever himself said that sunlight is the best antiseptic.
Right.
And so I think that's a pretty good guide.
The building of transparency often increases costs. if you want to be truly transparent. For example, let's say Nike wanted to be truly transparent about their whole manufacturing chain. They couldn't carry on manufacturing in China. They had to stop someday. So there's a cost element to building trust and building reputation and transparency. Is that worth it in the larger scheme of things if I'm selling soap or toothpaste?
I think it's not only worth it, I think it's sort of a cost of doing business today.
Right.
And I think that what we're ultimately talking about is heightened awareness around manufacturing, sourcing, labor. All of these things also have led to companies taking action that improve their corporate social responsibility. And that also, I think, is of value.
Give it to me in business metrics. If I put in $1 into improving trust, what do I get back out of it?
I'm not certain.
I'm not saying. I'm not asking you for a precise number.
Yeah.
Give me the upside that you see as Edelman.
I think the upside is that you'll have a longer relationship with your consumer.
Right.
We definitely have seen in our research that consumers that trust a brand will be more quick to purchase a new product, a line extension, something of that nature. They'll also be more inclined to be an advocate and help sell your product. And then most importantly, if you're facing difficult times, your brand advocates, your trusting consumers are going to come to your defense. And in many instances, some of the best crisis programs that I've seen, the consumers spoken up and said, this is not reflective of who this company or brand is. So that, to me, is building that trusted consumer base is worth the cost of the work.
Thank you so much. Thank
Absolutely.
you for a lovely conversation.
Yeah.
I hope to see you back in India.
I look forward to it. Thank you.
And that was Matthew Harrington in conversation with Anant Rangaswamy. Anant, what do you think marketers can take away from this conversation?
Again, I'll try and say from these three conversations that our viewers will get exposed to on trust, transparency, and the changing face of PR. Mm-hmm. I think PR is becoming intrinsic to their business.
Right.
And trust and transparency are impossible to avoid. That's all they need to take away from this. So I think they will relook at the way they view their PR agencies, and therefore perhaps even relook at who they work with.
Well, on that note, that's it from us on this episode of Melt. If you enjoyed watching this episode, do reach out to us on social media. Our handle is Ready to Melt, and I'll see you next week, same time, same place. Goodbye.